Okay, this is the quilt for this week. These are all blocks from the Block of the Day 2023. This is the Moda Love, the last block of the year, and it's 24-inch finished. So I chose some of the blocks that had the same fabrics or the same colors of fabrics to put around this. And you could, if you wanted to, you could just put these together just like they are now, block to block. But I want to separate each block because I don't want one block's neighbor yelling at another block. So I'm going to put a blue fabric, kind of a medium blue denim-like fabric between all of the blocks. So I'm going to start in the center, put a frame around this block. Then I'm going to prepare these side blocks by putting a sashing between these two. And the same thing on this side. Then I'll prepare the top ones with sashing in between them and the same as the bottom ones. And since I don't like square quilts, I'm going to put a 6-inch border at the top and a 6-inch border at the bottom. Actually, it's going to be 6-inch blocks in a row. And those blocks will have sashing in between them as well. And then I'm going to top it all off with a 3-inch pieced border all the way around. So we'll see how that goes. I've done my calculation. We'll see how they work out. I'm going to start in the center and put a frame around this, and then I'll show you each of the steps. First, I wanted to go over the instructions. These are 2 pages of instructions. You can download them from the description beneath the video. They're always free. So I still don't know what to name this quilt, but it's a sampler quilt. It's about 60 inches by 78 inch finished. And we have rotary cutting and AccuQuilt instructions. The center block is 24 inches finished. It can be 1 block, or you can choose 4 12-inch blocks and sew them block to block. But whatever you put in here has to finish at 24 inches because I have all of these sashing strips calculated so everything comes out even, because up here we're going to be putting 6-inch blocks and around the edge we're putting 3-inch blocks, so we needed those numbers to come out right. That is, if you plan on putting the 6-inch blocks rows here and the 3-inch block border. Otherwise, you'll see as we go along what your options are for this quilt. I've got fabric requirements for the sashing strips and the 6-inch blocks here, which are Friendship Star, and the 3-inch blocks, which are Signature blocks. All the rest, these 12-inch blocks and this 24-inch block in the center, you will use blocks you've already made. So there are no cutting instructions or fabric requirements for all of the interior here except for the sashing. Here are the cutting requirements for the sashing. This is the fabric I'm using for the sashing. I call it tooled leather, but it's from Moda Fabrics, and I will put a link in the description below the video. It's still available. It's one of their basics that's always there, and it comes in a bunch of colors. So this is what I'm using for the binding and for the sashing. We have all of our sashing strips, and they're in order of how you put them together. So strip A is sewn on first, and strip B is sewn on second, and so forth. So they're in order. Then down here I have the fabric requirements for the binding, and this is the background and accent fabrics for the 6-inch blocks here at the top and the bottom, and the 3-inch blocks around. So if you choose to do those blocks, here are the fabric requirements for those. On each step where we complete a unit, the instructions will tell you what the unit should measure. So you can, as you go, you can make sure that all of your stitches are correct. So these will go into depth and a little bit later. On the second page, we have the Friendship Star instructions in this chart and the signature block instructions in this chart. You see we have our A patch and B patch here. This is for rotary cutting. It tells you how many strips to cut and subcut. This is for AccuQuilt, and these will make this Friendship Star block. These are the 6-inch blocks. There is a video I did a year or so ago. If you scan this, it's called the Friendship Star Quilt. It's a variation of this. The fabrics are a little bit different, but it's pieced about the same way. And then if you make these Friendship Star blocks, then you'll continue with your instructions for putting them on the quilt here. And you have the option of stopping at this point if you want. And then here is the signature block and how many you need to make. Here is the A patch and the B patch. For the rotary cutting and for one option for AccuQuilt, we'll be cutting squares and using the stitch and flip method. And after I did one of these block of the day for this block, someone told me, can you use the signature die from AccuQuilt? And yes, you can. You can use the signature die and then the smaller half square triangle die. So that is option 2, and I've written that down here. And this is the option I did. So for this, you're cutting the signature like this. And then you'll cut 2 half square triangles. You'll just sew them on. Oops, yep, you'll sew them on this way. And here's what that block looks like. Rotary cutting, we're doing stitch and flip. If you don't have the companion cube, the 6-inch companion cube corners, then you can do the stitch and flip for AccuQuilt as well. So now I'm going to show you a series of pictures and then narrate what I did. After that, I'll have 3 different demos. The first will be a demo for the stitch and flip method, really short. And then I'll have a rotary cutting demo of a cutting technique, and then an AccuQuilt cutting technique and how you can figure out some fabric. So stay tuned. I started with the center block, which is video 1231, the Moda Love block. It was the very last one of 2023. Then I added 12 blocks that finish at 12 inches. I arranged them around the center block like in a frame. For the center block, you could substitute 4 12-inch finished blocks and set them block to block or any other design you choose. Just remember that in order for the measurements in this pattern to work, whatever you put in this space has to finish at 24 inches. Here are 6 examples of blocks that make secondary designs when set block to block. I think any of these would look good in this center as a replacement of the Moda Love block. These were all blocks of the day in 2023, and there are links in the description below the video to each of those videos. Now we start adding the sashing strips. When I'm framing a block, I usually add the sides first, so I added 1 strip A to each side. Normally I press the seams open, but for this quilt I press the seams toward the sashing. The B sashing strips were added to the top and bottom to complete the center unit. This unit should measure 28.5 inches square at this point. Next, I pieced the side units. Between the blocks for each side, I stitched a D strip. At the top and bottom, I added C strips. Each of the side units should measure 12.5 by 28.5. The side units are stitched to the center unit. At this point, the unit measures 52.5 inches across and 28.5 inches tall. Next, I took the top 4 blocks and sewed them into a row using the C and D strips. 1 D strip is in the center, and the C strips separate the other blocks. You might want to take a look at the diagram to be sure of the placement of these. I repeated the process for the 4 blocks at the bottom. Now sew the top row to the top and the bottom row to the bottom. The top now measures 52.5 inches square. If you wanted to, you could stop at this point and have a square quilt that finishes at 52 inches. In that case, I would use the same sashing fabric for the binding to complete the framing of all the blocks. I'm not a big fan of square quilts, so I continued by adding 6-inch finished blocks to the top and the bottom. Here I'm auditioning placement of the fabrics for the Friendship Star block. I used the same fabric for the backgrounds and the centers of each block. I added E and F strips between the blocks and a G strip to the top and the bottom of each row. At this point, each row should measure 52.5 inches wide by 10.5 inches tall. Here, the top and bottom rows are sewn to the quilt top. The top should now measure 52 inches wide by 72.5 inches tall. You could stop at this point if you like. If I planned to stop here, I would not add the G strip to the top or to the bottom of the quilt. Instead, I would complete the frame by using the sashing fabric for the binding. That would make the finished quilt 52 inches by 68 inches. I wanted to make the quilt just a little bit bigger, so I continued by adding one H strip to each side of the quilt top. The top should now measure 54.5 inches by 72.5 inches. The last thing I did was add a 3-inch border of signature blocks in this zigzag pattern. I used one fabric for the background and scrappy fabrics for the accent. I sewed 24 blocks together for each side and sewed them on first. And finally, I sewed 20 blocks each for the top and the bottom. This makes a total of 88 3-inch finished signature blocks. As I was sewing the signature block borders on, I made sure that the corners were always positioned as you see here in this green block. Since there's an even number of blocks on the sides and top and bottom, then this pattern should work out fine. This quilt finishes at 60 inches by 78 inches. I don't have my quilting machine anymore, or I would show you a finished quilt. But for quilting design, I usually choose all over kind of swirly or loopy designs that are just kind of free-form designs. And I think a variegated thread would look amazing on this quilt. We're going to do stitch and flip or folded corner clipper or whatever method you choose to do these folded corners. So on the back of all the small squares, you'll draw a diagonal line, and we'll need 2 squares for each of the large squares. We'll place them like this on the large square. This is the corner we're going to cut off. So when we take this to the machine, we're going to stitch just to the right of this line. We're not going to stitch on the line, just to the right. It's kind of like getting a scant 1/4 inch. It gives you a little bit extra wiggle room. So do that on this side and put this on the other side, the opposite side, and do the same thing. Turn it like this, stitch just to the right-hand side of that line. Now stitched all of them, we'll trim a 1/4 inch away from this line we just stitched. And it doesn't have to be exact. You stitch that side, flip it around, and do this other side. And then we press our seams open and we'll have our unit like this. For rotary cutting, I layer the fabric 4 layers. Even up one side, flip it around, and then I cut 2 strips from 5 inches. I first make the 5-inch cut, then I make the 2.5-inch cut, and I have 2 of my strips. Next, I want to subcut these into 16 2.5-inch squares. So I'm moving the selvage away so I can cut the selvage off and the fold off at the same time. And then I want to check that I have 10 inches of usable space. Just measure. I have more than 10 inches that I need. I'm checking the fold underneath and I'm cutting off the fold and the selvages. Next, I position my ruler at the 5-inch mark and cut. Then I move it down to the 2.5-inch mark and cut. Now I have 8 pieces cut. Now do the same thing, the 5-inch mark and cut, and the 2.5-inch mark and cut. Now I have my 16 2.5-inch squares. Quilt, I want to show you how I cut patch A, which are the squares and they're made from the background fabric. I'm going to use one background fabric for all of the friendship stars. In the AccuQuilt dies, you can use the 8-inch cube die number 2. And that's this die here. From one piece of fabric, you'll get 4 squares. Now I want to figure out how many pieces of fabric I need to put on this die to give me 70 patches when I'm finished. So we'll take 70 and divide it by 4 because each pass will give me 4 patch A's. And that comes out to 17 and some change. So we'll just say 18. So that tells me I need 18 squares to put on this die. And this die, I've written 5.5 inches for the size. You may make yours smaller, but that's how I'm making mine. I'm going to take 5.5 inches for the lengthwise grain and 5.5 inches for the crosswise grain, and I need 18. So we'll take this to our quilt calculator. And this is the calculator you can find on my website, and I'll have a link to it. So what we're going to do is for the lengthwise grain, we're going to put 5.5. The crosswise grain, we'll put 5.5. And the number of patches needed is 18. Because remember, we need 70 patches, but this die will give us 4 for each pass. So I'll put 18 here. So it automatically calculates how much fabric I need. So I'll need to cut 3 strips at 5.5 inches times the width of fabric. What I'm going to do now is take my 3 strips of fabric cut at 5.5 inches. I'm going to line them up. And remember, these are rough cuts, so we don't have to worry about being exact. There's 6 layers of fabric here. And I'm going to lay it on the die, and I'm looking at my lines I drew on the die for placement. And I want to make sure that I clear this selvage. I don't want to cut any selvage, so I'm going to move it over and just check. And these dies are placed on here at a slight angle. So if you marked your lines like I did here, you just line up against that line. Now I have 6 layers of fabric. I'm going to put my mat on here, and I'm going to make my first cut. Now we rub the mat to take all the static off of it and slide it off. Take off the excess. Now we have 6 times 4, which is 24 2.5 inch squares. Normally you should put the lengthwise grain along this label, but these are squares, and either way I put it, it's going to be a lengthwise or a crosswise in one part, so I don't pay attention to that for cutting these squares. Now I'm going to trim off these because they're just in the way, and fix my stack again, and then put this stack back on here and make sure everything is nice and even. Put your mat back on and make another cut. I'm taking my mat off. I'm going to take this excess and cut it off right now while I have it in my hand. And here I have another 24. So I have 48 squares. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.